Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. So hope everyone's doing good. It is Sunday at 11:15. Another beautiful day. This weather has been pretty fantastic. Still, here we are, just about well, technically a week or two away from the start of the fall season. So yeah, on one hand, I do love the fall. Fall is really nice. It is, of course, leading into my favorite holiday of all time, and that, of course, is Halloween. Huge, my favorite holiday. I love it, love it, love it. And so, but that also leads into the emergence of the colder season coming in to play. So I'm not a huge fan of cold winter weather, but it is what it is. I'm a summertime person. I do love the holidays and all those things, but I'm not a huge wintertime person fan. I don't really do lots of winter activities, if you will, but the past couple of years have been pretty mild, and they've thankfully been a little bit busier than normal. So we'll see. But hey, it's always a good time. It's especially a good time during the winter, darker nights, darker days to watch movies. So, but again, I watch movies regardless, so it doesn't really matter. Anyway, so I went to Bull Moose again yesterday. It was I went up to pick I went to pick up a couple of albums. And unfortunately, one of the albums was not in. They I was told I went to Bull Moose up in Bangor. I had ordered two albums, and I waited about two and a half months for these albums to come in. Totally ridiculous. No wonder. No wonder. Well, it's just there's not a demand for physical media as far as CDs. Records are still, doing well, but I don't have a record player that I use. I like to have CDs for throw them in my car, throw them in my house. They're easy that way. They're obviously it takes up room. It's not like using Bandcamp or Spotify, but I I like the convenience of them, and I have a shit ton of CDs. So, but people don't really buy music that way anymore. So it's why there's no demand. So I just yeah, I had to wait so long, and then so I got a call a week ago, or less than a week ago, from Bull Moose saying that my albums were in the CDs. So I went up yesterday, and then they told me I bought some really great movies and things like that when I went up there. But when I went up there, they said, well, no, only one of the movies came in, and I was just like, Jesus Christ. But anyway, one of the ended up being one of the albums that I had ordered. Out of the two, only one actually showed up. So I was just like, Jesus, I'm kind of done with ordering albums anymore, unless I order them directly. But even that is a pain in the ass. So I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do as far as my access to buying new albums and things like that, because it's in this day and age, if you're trying to hold on to this idea of physical media to get CDs and things, it's a pain in the ass. It's almost next to impossible. And I know people who collect vinyl, and that's a big thing, and I love vinyl, but I just don't have the space, and I just don't have the setup for it. Have been in my past. I used to buy lots of records, but it's way more expensive right now. It's way too much of an expense. So we'll see what happens. But I'm trying to figure out a plan as far as what I can do to transition to make it somehow easier with buying new music and supporting bands and things that I love. And it's kind of ridiculous. But anyway, so I went up and I got some sick ass movies yesterday. Apple was super excited. One of the movies, I got a whole slew of movies, but the one movie I bought, which I was like, holy shit, I can't believe they have this, and I haven't seen this in years. And I had heard about it fairly recently again, and I was like, you know what? I have not seen that movie in since I was a little kid, and I loved this movie as a kid, and they turned it. they did turn it into a franchise. I believe there's like three or four in this series, and that is Terry O'Quinn in The Stepfather. I can't believe they had this. I was just like, holy shit! I haven't seen this movie in years. I love the shit out of this movie as a kid. This was a this was a movie, a horror movie that I used to watch a lot as a kid. I remember it was we used to rent it a lot, and I remember seeing it on VHS, and I remember seeing it on it was on cable at the time. I remember watching this film with my mom a few times. It was really funny. She loved this movie also, and uh, so I watched this the other night, and oh my god, I swear it's like one of those movies. It actually is better now watching it. It came out in 1987. It was directed by Joseph Rubin. Of course, Terry O'Quinn, who went on to become a pretty big star, especially in the TV series Lost. Jill Sholem, Shelley Hack, Charles Lehner, and Stephen Shellen, and Gabriel Rose. This this DVD, this Blu-ray is super killer. I'm super excited that I bought this, and I finished it. I watched this last night, and it's one of those things. This came out in the late '80s, and which is late '70s, early '80s is my favorite decade for movies. The '70s are definitely my favorite decade. But in the recent years, I've really discovered different films from even the '60s and '50s even that have been just awesome experiences. A lot of first time watches, and also really key movies in the world of exploitation. But this movie is great. I kind of There's a really great special features uh, interview, behind the scenes documentary on the Stepfather. It's great, and the director talks about this movie came out in the '80s when it was kind of '87 was kind of when from probably 78 to about 83, 84 was probably like the height of the slasher genre, but they were still coming out right up into the '90s. And the slasher genre is my favorite subgenre, if you will, in the world of exploitation. And so there were thousands of slasher movies coming out, franchises. You had all the amazing Lucio Fulci movies coming out. You had obviously the Friday 13th, Halloween franchise that started, Texas Chainsaw. Man, just My Bloody Valentine, Sleepaway Camp, just so many. Mad Men, Maniac. I mean, just the list is endless. So it's interesting because the director was talking about in this making of or documentary where they were when he got the call to do this movie, he was thinking, oh, okay, this is going to be because the premise is kind of what you would assume that would be a slasher film. And essentially it's this film about this guy who is a serial killer, and he kills his family, and then he changes his identity, and then he moves on and basically starts up another family, and he builds this whole another community, but then he goes into this whole rampage again. So it's like his violent dark side comes out again. And so the director was talking about, well, he did not want to turn this into like a cash grab slasher movie and make it just this like paint by numbers, low down and dirty slasher movie, which for me would have been awesome. But he's like, no, I wanted to make this more of a character driven story and make this more of a suspense film. And and that's what you get with this film. I still consider this movie a slasher movie, but it's kind of like a high end slasher movie. I mean, generally slasher movies are pretty lowbrow and they're pretty nasty. They are, copies of a copy to a degree. There's a formula. But, you know, there's so many great movies in the genre that I feel any of those titles that I threw out a few minutes ago in the slasher genre, yeah, on one hand they are formulaic. They do have this template that they follow. You know, you have the the young teenagers that get picked off one by one. There's like a masked killer. There's a lot of a lot of sex. There's a lot of violence. Great kills. A lot of the films are set in at a summer camp or in the woods. You know, your typical tropes that you see in the slasher movie. But that being said, so there's a template. But that being said, I think a lot of the movies that I named, even though they follow a certain template, which arguably was created by probably, and I've done a couple of shows on it, but the most influential and probably the most important slasher movie that really ushered in this new kind of genre was Black Christmas, which came out in the early 70s. That really was the most. That movie is probably the most important movie when it comes to the slasher genre. You know, that predated Halloween, predated Friday the 13th, many movies. But all those titles I mentioned, like yeah, there's a template, there's a certain kind of formulaic thing that slasher movies follow. But I also feel all of those titles that I mentioned, they're all they're all like uniquely their own thing. Like they have their own kind of unique universe. You know, I think if you think of movies like my all-time favorite slasher movie, Maniac by Bill Lustig, which came out in '81, my favorite slasher movie of all time. You look at that and you know compare that to say My Bloody Valentine, or which is another iconic movie, or The Toolbox Murders, or say Madman, or even John Carpenter's Halloween. All of those movies to me are so on their own terms, or in their own terms, very charismatic and have their own kind of voice. They're all very different. They all have their own separate universe that they built. That's unique, and it's I think they all stand out. They're not just total cash grab. So sometimes I think, and there is that does happen in the genre, but I think generally it's too uh, broad of a stroke to paint. I think it's too much of a generalization because I think when you look at those movies that I just mentioned, they are unique in their respected genres. They all have something unique about them. So, you know, I don't really believe that. It's interesting, but I do consider the Stepfather to be a slasher movie, but it's a little bit of a higher level of a slasher movie. A lot of slasher movies are very low budget, kind of lowbrow. You know, some bad acting, some bad writing, but it's always for me usually the case of it's so bad it's so good. And there's that fine line that I'm always kind of fascinated with when it comes to this genre of exploitation or low budget indie films that are being considered B movies, or real trashy subculture film genres. So it's always interesting to me that how that totes that line. But I feel like Stepfather is more of a, I consider it a slasher movie, definitely, but it's very suspenseful. Really great characters. Terry O'Quinn is amazing in this movie. I used to see this movie all the time when I was a kid, and I love this movie. It always scared me. It was always one of my favorite slasher movies, or movies about a serial killer. It was one of the first movies I saw as a kid about a serial killer, and it's actually based on a true story, which is totally insane. True life account. So, but watching this movie, I feel on Blu-ray, it's like it's even better now. I think it goes beyond holding up the test of time. I think this movie just totally kicks ass. Really great, beautiful transfer. The documentary about the stepfather is really great. There's also, which I think I've seen most of them. I don't remember them being particularly that good, but they're this did spawn a franchise. I believe there's two or three other films tied to this uh, first movie. But I remember it's so funny because I was a pretty big fan of Lost when it came out, and Terry O'Quinn was a major star in that movie or in that series, and he went on to pretty big stardom because of that show. But I remember always seeing whenever I would watch Lost and Terry O'Quinn was in it because he was one of the lead characters. I would always think, wow, that's the guy who played the stepfather. He's like this, he played this totally, murderous psychopath in that great movie. And so I always, every time I would see him in Lost, because he plays such a different role, every time I saw him in that show, that's all I thought about. So it was always funny. So every time I think of him, I think of him because of this movie, because I feel like his role in this movie is so good. In this movie, I think ages really really well. There's nothing, it's got it's an '80s movie. It came out in '87, so there's like some things in this movie that are super cheesy and kind of ridiculous. And this movie is a way more. It's almost like a comedy. There's some things in this movie that are super hilarious, and I think it's great. I think all of those things, even the dated qualities for this movie, make it even more. It gives it a longer lasting shelf life. It's great. It's a fantastic movie. It's really well directed. It's way more funny than I thought, and it's actually more brutal in as far as the kills go than I remember it being. It's a really good movie. It's total '80s, but I love it. And '80s, the decade of the '80s to me just rules. The things, couple of things that stood out for me that I was like, wow, like this is really these are two things that I didn't realize how well they are. But the black comedy aspect of it, this movie is funnier than I remember it being, which is really great. It's a great balance. Gives you a little bit more variety for the film and the feel, the storyline, the aesthetic, and the kills. The kills are actually really great. The opening sequence to this movie is pretty brutal, and I forgot about that. So it's an awesome movie. I can't recommend it enough, and I got a really good deal on it. You just never know. The some of these re-releases on Blu-ray and 4K are just astounding, and this is a great classic movie from the '80s. I think it's the best thing that Terry O'Quinn's ever done, and I think if you see this movie and know who he is as an actor, that's all you'll automatically typecast him as a serial killer because his acting in this movie is so damn good. I mean, he plays a pretty complex role. Like he's plays this totally straight guy, and then he plays this complete and utter like psychopath, and then he's also playing all of those angles through like this comedic, lens or performance. And so he's like, I kind of feel like he's playing these three different characters, which is, really, really, really complex when you think about it from a technical level. And it's awesome. It was the first thing he ever did, too, the first movie or role that he ever got as an actor. And he's awesome. Like, he's really good in this movie. So, yeah, I can't recommend it enough if you've never seen it. Killer slasher movie. I consider this to be a highbrow slasher movie, but still a slasher movie. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.